Welcome to our next lesson on baseball and how it became referred to as the American pastime. So, in this lesson, we're going to talk about the 1890s in baseball. Ban Johnson, Cy Young and Ty Cobb, 2 stars, and John McGraw and Connie Mack. The Federal League Challenge, 8 men out, the 1919 Black Sox scandal. The Babe Ruth, and baseball's golden age. Baseball, America's pastime. Is baseball still America's pastime? Why do you think it is, or why do you think it isn't? Has it been replaced by football as America's pastime? Are baseball players overpaid? Are they underpaid? Do we need more teams in baseball, or do you think we need fewer teams? Some things to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this lesson. Between 1890 and 1930, baseball was the most popular sport in America by far. There were millions of amateur participants. And town teams sprang up all over the country, YMCA leagues, semi-professional leagues. Employers and businesses sponsored industrial and commercial leagues. And company teams often hired ringers to play for their team to do well. Due to racial segregation, African Americans formed their own amateur and semi-professional teams and leagues, sometimes even playing exhibition games against white teams. Boys of all ages played in any vacant lot or open small town field they could find, choosing up sides and playing informal games until it got dark and it was too dark to see. Construction of modern stadiums for major league teams soon began, seating anywhere from 20 to 35,000 spectators. Some of them were double-deck structures made of brick, concrete, and steel. Shibe Park in Philadelphia, Briggs Stadium, also known as Tiger Stadium in Detroit, Crosby Field in Cincinnati, Griffin Stadium in D.C., Fenway Park, Wrigley Field, Comiskey Park, Ebbets Field, and the Polo Grounds. Here's some of them right there. Shibe Park, big square, huh? Briggs Stadium, also known as Tiger Stadium. Griffin Stadium in Washington, D.C. Comiskey Park, where the White Sox played for a long time. Ebbets Field, kind of shaped like a diamond, huh? And the horseshoe-shaped Polo Grounds in New York City. In 1923, the Yankees opened the most famous ballpark in America, located in the lower Bronx, New York. Held capacity of over 70,000 spectators, and was the first triple-decked ballpark in America, and the first park called a stadium. Yankee Stadium was known as the first stadium, or commonly referred to as the house that Ruth built. I'm going to discuss Yankee Stadium and the house that Ruth built in a later lesson. Modern ballparks are financed by local governments. These older ballparks are paid for by team ownership, and only 2 of these actually still remain: Wrigley Field in Chicago and Fenway Park in Boston. Baseball had a hold on America's mind, on their soul. The game is found throughout literature, in music, in theater. Ernest Thayer's Casey at the Bat poem, "There is no joy in Mudville, the mighty Casey has struck out." In 1908, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" was written, which is sung usually at the 7th inning stretch in most ballparks. And in 1955, the Broadway hit "Damn Yankees." 1890s, years of problems. Now, by 1890, the National League stood as the only remaining Major League Baseball professional league. They expanded to 12 teams at this time. They added teams in Washington, St. Louis, Louisville, and Baltimore. But attendance fell in 1894 when there was a severe economic downturn. The best teams were the Baltimore Orioles and the Boston Beaneaters. The standard was the scientific or inside game. Remember, we talked about this dead ball era. The style had low scoring, sacrifice bunts, lots of stolen bases, hit and run, solid pitching and defense, taking advantage of the dead ball era. A lot of teams played with a win-at-any-cost mentality. Spikes were sharpened and used as weapons when runners would slide into a base. Base runners were held by the belt by an infielder when the umpire wasn't looking. Pitchers intimidated batters with high and inside fastballs. And Orioles manager, that guy right there, John McGraw, used a lot of physical and verbal attacks on umpires to intimidate them. Falling attendance and poor economic times led to slashed player salaries. By 1895, the average paycheck was down by 30% for ball players. Players obviously complained, but had no other options. If the National League was the only league, where else are you going to go? So, they would either have to play with this salary or quit baseball. This led to repeated rumors of players throwing games for gamblers to try to make extra money. Also, players would bet on games themselves that they played in. Ban Johnson in the American League. Now, these hard times in the 1890s opened the door for new leadership. Byron Bancroft Johnson, Ban Johnson. Hard-charging guy, heavy drinking, chain smoking. He's a journalist from Cincinnati. He was a sports writer and editor of the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette. Also, he was the president of the top minor league at the time, the Western League. Now, in 1899, he took advantage of patriotic feelings that Americans had from winning the Spanish-American War, and he established the American League. In 1901, he asked the National League if they could be seen as an equal and another major league. The National League told him to go stick it. They refused. Johnson declared war on the National League. He stole players from the National League by offering them more money. Also placed franchises in some National League cities to compete with them. And lured more than 100 players from the National League to the American League. The economy started to boom again, and he had little trouble finding new owners and new teams. For example, Clark Griffith in Washington, D.C., the Senators. Ben and Tom Scheib with Connie Mack there in the bowler hat, the Athletics in Philadelphia. Charles Kaminsky, remember we talked about Kaminsky Park, Chicago White Sox. And Charles Summers in Cleveland, Cleveland Indians. The American League became more successful over time and drew almost as many spectators as the National League. The National League decided it needed to make peace at one point with the American League, and in 1903 agreed to coexist peacefully and abstain from signing the other league's players. They agreed that both leagues could field teams in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and St. Louis. A national commission was created to supervise over the operations of both leagues. The president of the National League, American League, and a mutually accepted third person would be this commission. Ban Johnson was connected to all three people and dominated the policy-making administration of the National Commission. He became soon known as baseball's czar. The commission established a stable and orderly climate for professional baseball. There were few legal problems at this time, few player defections, labor disputes, and franchise moves. Baseball then enters a 50-year period of peace, really. For the next 50 years, things were pretty stable. No franchise moves, little turnover in team ownership, very stable in Major League Baseball. Johnson focused on improving the game's integrity. He started Ladies' Days, Lady Day games where women were admitted for a reduced price. He also cracked down on players and managers who abused umpires, and launched an anti-gambling crusade to try to clean up the sport. The biggest creation was creating a postseason playoff between the two leagues, the champions of the two leagues, American and National League. Now, in October of 1903, the National League champions, Pittsburgh Pirates, played the Boston champions. Sometimes the Boston team was known as the Americans, the Pilgrims, or the Puritans. Boston won the series 5-3. Back then you had to win 5 games, not 4 games like it is now. The next year, New York Giants won the National League pennant, but manager John McGraw refused to play Boston in the World Series because there was a feud between McGraw and Ban Johnson. 1905, New York Giants win again and beat the Philadelphia Athletics. Stability and growth, the Cyclone and the Georgia Peach. Under Ban Johnson's leadership, baseball became seen as more respectable. It was exciting to see pennant races and star players, and this increased attendance. In 1909, they exceeded 7 million spectators. The value of franchises continued to grow also at this time, and stability led to strong fan loyalties in cities. A sure sign that baseball achieved a special place in America was on 1910 opening day of the season. Then, President William Howard Taft threw out the ceremonial first ball of the season. The Washington Senators owner Clark Griffin installs a so-called presidential box for Taft to sit in. Also, and another important thing happened during this game, during the middle of the 7th inning, Taft's legs got a little stiff, and he stood to stretch his legs. And all the spectators behind him also stood, and so begins the tradition of the 7th inning stretch. Cy Young, Denton True Cy Young, an early sensation. A farm boy from northeastern Ohio, Cy Young was given the name Cyclone as a teenager because of the velocity of his fastball. 1890, he started with the Cleveland Spiders. There's a name for you, huh? Spiders. And pitched there for 23 years. He had a fastball, 2 distinctive types of curveballs, a changeup, and a spitball, which was actually legal until 1920 to throw a spitball. Over 10 seasons he spent with the Spiders. He won more than 20 games each season. 3 times he won more than 30 games a season. He pitched also for Boston and had back-to-back 30-game seasons there. 1904, he actually pitched 24 consecutive hitless innings, which is still a Major League Baseball record today. He also threw the first perfect game. No runs, no hits, no errors, no walks, nothing. He retired at age 45 with a record of 511 wins and 316 losses. I doubt anybody will ever have more than 511 wins. Ty Cobb. Tyrus Raymond Cobb, the Georgia Peach. Played center field for the Detroit Tigers. Since slapping a double to right center in August of 1905, he dominated hitting in baseball. Very intensely driven guy. Mastered the subtleties of this dead ball era, the scientific strategies of this dead ball era. A man of excesses. Ferocious base running, sliding with spikes up to spike infielders. Continual verbal warfare with teammates, opponents, umpires, even people in the stands. An unending flow of vulgarity came from his mouth. He feared no one, and Ty Cobb was always ready to fight. Supposedly he had a mean streak of racism, but other people say this was just a story. Just a myth about Ty Cobb. He wasn't really a racist. He beat opponents senseless and went into the stands to attack hecklers. He once even assaulted a physically disabled fan who was in a wheelchair in the stands. He retired in 1928 at the age of 43. Notice how he holds the bat. Chokes up just a little, but his hands have like an inch or so separation between them to get better control of the bat to hit. He holds 43 records, had a .366 lifetime batting average, and over 4,000 hits. He led the American League in stolen bases 6 times, and in 1915 he stole 96 bases, which is a record that stood until 1962 when Maury Wills broke it. And now the career stolen base record is 897, broken in 1977 by Lou Brock of the St. Louis Cardinals. Now, in terms of Ty Cobb, some people say he was a racist and singled out African Americans for abuse, and that he fought with bellmen, laborers. Supposedly in 1914 he pulled a gun on a neighborhood butcher because he was ticked off at him. He was detested by his teammates, and on the road he roomed alone and ate alone. If you recall the movie Field of Dreams, the ghosts that come out of the cornfield, so that they didn't bring Ty Cobb with them because nobody liked him. He had 2 failed marriages, was shunned by his children, and lived his life alone and angry until he died in 1961. Only 3 people that were associated with baseball attended Ty Cobb's funeral when he died. He was one of the original 5 original candidates for the Hall of Fame, and he actually got more votes than any other player, including Babe Ruth, for the Hall of Fame. Masters of strategy, McGraw and Mack. So John McGraw. John McGraw managed the New York Giants from 1902 until 1932. He began as a third baseman in 1891 for the Baltimore Orioles. A rough guy, and would do almost anything to win. A student of the game, was named player manager of the Orioles in 1899 at the age of 26. A master at intimidating umpires. John McGraw was a perfect fit for New York, a temperamental Irish personality, hard drinking, and very popular New York resident. His teams reflected his personality, his win-at-all-costs personality. He won 10 National League pennants. 11 times his teams came in second place, and he won 3 World Series. Connie Mack, the polar opposite, the opposite of McGraw. Connie Mack was born 1864 to Irish immigrant parents. Cornelius McGillicuddy shortened it to Connie Mack. Changed his name to Mack because a lot of people didn't like the Irish when they first came here. They thought they were horrible people. You know, they were Catholics. The Protestant people here didn't understand Catholics, and they hated the Irish. He played every position except for pitcher. He was mostly a catcher. In 1901, he joined the Philadelphia team as general manager and purchased 25% of the club from the Shive brothers. He soon acquired all the shares and became the sole owner of the Philadelphia Athletics. He served as owner, general manager, and also manager of the Athletics. He won 9 American League pennants, but 17 times his teams also came in last place. He won 3,776 times and lost 4,925 games. What he would do with it, he would build teams and then trade them in big fire sales. He always thought that the ideal season was you have a good first half of the year, the team's in first place, and people are coming to the games, and then the team would tail off at the end of the year and lose. And that way you still had the attendance, you made money from the receipts, but if the players lost, you could always go to them and say, well, you know, you guys lost, you didn't do well second half of the year, I'm not going to give you a raise. He sat quietly in the dugout during games, and he maybe was the last manager to wear street clothes. He wore a 3-piece suit, white dress shirt, and a tie instead of a uniform, and a derby hat instead of a baseball cap. He demanded that his players play clean and had good behavior both on and off the field. He didn't swear, smoke, gamble, or drink. McGraw called his team a white elephant, making fun of his Athletics. And that's why sometimes you'll see one of the mascots of the Athletics is a big elephant. The Federal League Challenge. The Federal League Challenge. The new short-lived league was formed from 1914 to 1915, the Federal League. The new league failed, but filed a lawsuit, a very important lawsuit, alleging that organized baseball constituted a cartel of restraint of trade. The case went to the federal judge, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, that happy-looking guy there on the left. He sat on the case rather than taking any action. The suit alleged violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case eventually went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The justices there handed baseball an unprecedented umbrella of protection of antitrust laws. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, that guy there on the right, wrote the majority decision. Holmes said that although baseball is a for-profit business, it was not trade or commerce in the commonly accepted use of those words. Players did not produce a product. They only produced effort. Baseball remains even today the only professional sport to enjoy this exemption, and ownership has exploited this ever since this time. 8 men out, the 1919 World Series. After order was restored in the Major League, the owners held the upper hand. They cut players' salaries to increase their profits, while they make more money. Baseball was affected by World War I and losing over 227 players to military service. In 1918, the season ended short. The season was a disaster and shortened to only 140 games, with the Red Sox beating the Cubs. The Red Sox beat the Cubs with their star pitcher right there, Babe Ruth. If the war didn't end, the 1919 season was likely going to be canceled. The 1919 World Series was heavily favored by the Chicago White Sox. The White Sox were heavily favored over the Cincinnati Reds. The Reds won 5-3 games. However, it was revealed that 8 Chicago players took $100,000 from gamblers to throw the World Series to lose. The story was kept alive by that guy right there, Chicago newspaperman Hugh Fullerton. The stars of the team were shoeless Joe Jackson and pitcher Eddie Cicotte. They admitted under oath to a federal grand jury. They also implicated 6 of their other teammates. As shoeless Joe Jackson entered the courtroom, a young boy was said to ask him, "Say it ain't so, Joe." And Joe Jackson responded, "I'm afraid it is, son." The grand jury charged the 8 men, and a trial was set. Baseball executives went into damage control, as you might imagine. Said that the players go into slumps. Things happen. Pitchers get wild. They throw wild pitches. Errors are made in the outfield. Things happen. The rumors persisted and the investigation went on. Pitcher Ed Cicotte hatched the whole idea, supposedly. He got $100,000 from 2 separate groups of gamblers. And players saw it as a payback for the low paychecks that they got from Charles Kaminsky, the owner of the White Sox. One group of gamblers was headed by Abe Attell, a former boxer, the guy there on the top right. The other group was headed by Arnold Rothstein, noted New York City gambler and gangster, that guy on the lower right. You ever see that HBO show Boardwalk Empire? He kind of actually looks like the actor that played him. The trial began on November 6, 1920, but the trial was a farce from the beginning because all the grand jury records and all the evidence had been stolen. It was lost. So the district attorney dropped the case. But the new commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, that name sound familiar? Thought it questioned the integrity of the game. He said their behavior was detrimental to the interests of the game. So he banned all 8 players from baseball for life. The public was also at this time in favor of this decision. The team would forever be known as the Chicago Black Sox of 1919. The Babe, Babe Ruth. Historians have referred to this era of America in the 1920s as the Golden Age. Sports became big business during this time. Fans would flock to stadiums to watch their favorite teams and their favorite stars play. Motion pictures were popular, radio, and expanded print media contributed to this growing frenzy. The stage is set for the coronation of the most popular sports figure of that time. The Babe, George Herman Ruth Jr. He first gained attention as a young pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. He won 23 games in 1916. But his batting ability could not be ignored, especially his power. While everyone else was playing that scientific inside game, he was hitting home runs. In 1919, he set the record for home runs, hitting 29 home runs that season. As a pitcher, he won 85 games with a 2.70 ERA. Fans were attracted to his play, along with his personality and his youthful exuberance. In 1920, the Red Sox owner Harry Frazee sold Ruth's contract to the New York Yankees for the sum of $100,000. So Ruth now lands in the nation's largest and most exciting city during this golden age of sports. And we're going to be talking about more about the Yankees and Red Sox and this selling of Babe Ruth to the Yankees in 1920 on the final lesson in this class, Yankees Universe versus Red Sox Nation. Ruth became the biggest show in town. In 1920, he hit .376 with 54 home runs, which was unheard of at that time, which is even pretty great by our standards today. He had a bigger-than-life personality, hearty appetite for food, alcohol, and women. Sometimes in between games of a doubleheader, he would down 3 or 4 hot dogs. By the way, his favorite way to eat a hot dog was with mustard, onions, and sauerkraut. Shortly after arriving in New York, he joined up with publicist Christy Walsh. Walsh molded Ruth's public image as a benefactor to the poor and friend to children. As you can see there, lots of pictures like that of him playing with kids or going to visit kids in the hospital, things of that nature. Walsh secured motion picture and vaudeville appearances for the Babe to make money. Also endorsements for things like gum, baseball, caps, home run shoes, smoking tobacco, and even automobiles. Walsh called all the shots and managed all of Ruth's investments. So Ruth was able to live comfortably throughout the Depression and until his death in 1948. In 1921, Babe Ruth hit 59 home runs with 170 RBIs. 1923, the Yankee Stadium is built, and Ruth hits the first home run in Yankee Stadium. 1927 was his best year ever, where he had 60 home runs that year, the record that stood until 1961. 1930, he had an $80,000 salary, which was actually $5,000 more than what the President of the United States, President Herbert Hoover, made that year. When somebody asked him why he was making more than the president, he said, "Why not? I had a better year than he did." By the early 1930s, Ruth was gaining a lot of weight, and his all-night binges were catching up on him. But a very interesting thing happened when the Yankees played the Chicago Cubs in the 1932 World Series. Babe Ruth's famous supposed call shot of pitcher Charlie Root of the Cubs. Supposedly, as you see there in the picture, at one point, Babe Ruth points to center field in Wrigley Field, and then in the next pitch, he hits a home run right where he pointed. In 1935, Babe Ruth is traded by the Yankees to the Boston Braves. He wanted to manage, but no team wanted him because of his background, his wildness, and everything. By late May of 1935, he hits his last home run, a 600-foot home run over the second deck in Pittsburgh. Home run number 714. There's a picture of supposedly Babe's called shot. See him pointing to center field? Some people say it happened, some people say it didn't. Baseball's golden age. Yankee owner Jacob Rupert, the guy there on top, and general manager Ed Barrow, that second gentleman, assembled great teams in New York. Along with Root, they had Lou Gehrig, Earl Combs, Bob Musial, Tony Lazzeri. The 1927 team was called Murder's Row. In the National League, the St. Louis Cardinals also created some great teams. Over the next 20 years, they won 9 pennants and 6 World Series due to the front office leadership of Branch Rickey, the general manager. Branch Rickey operated in the small market of St. Louis. He had to use a lot of creative methods to build pennant-contending teams. He created a so-called feeder system by acquiring minor league teams. What he would do is he'd sign large numbers of young prospects at a low cost and put them in these minor league teams, where he assembled a coaching staff to teach the prospects the sound fundamentals of baseball, building a system from the inside out, the ground up. Ricky's so-called farm system provided the Cards with a steady stream of players. The Cardinals would not buy another player for the next 30 years because of this farm system. Other teams, especially the Yankees, picked up on this idea of developing young players in their farm system. And they created their own farm club type system, just like the Cardinals. Also during this time, Commissioner Mountain Landis acquired complete power over baseball. Looks like a fun guy, huh? He became known as the Czar of Baseball. An imperial attitude, arbitrary decision-making. He angered some, but no one had the power to oppose him or depose him as Commissioner of Baseball. He died at the age of 78, trying to derail efforts to end racial desegregation in baseball. Now, by the end of the 1920s, millions of baseball fans developed a love of this game, their favorite teams, their favorite game. Americans took their baseball very seriously. They accorded the game a special place in the life of our nation. Historian Harold Seymour once said, "Baseball produced a profound emotional grip on the public that gave the game genuine vitality." Now here are several interesting issues that I want you to think about. Should the baseball commissioner have total power over Major League Baseball? Is gambling taking place in baseball? Is it taking place we just don't know about it? Or is it just not taking place? Is it taking place in other sports? What's the problem with gambling? So what if players gamble? What's the cause of the problem? And speaking of gambling in baseball, should Pete Rose be in the Baseball Hall of Fame? Okay, in reviewing this lesson, we talked about the 1890s and problems in baseball. Van Johnson, president of the American League. Cy Young and Ty Cobb, two stars. Two great managers, John McGraw and Connie Mack. The Federal League. 8 men out and the 1919 Black Sox scandal. The Babe Ruth, and baseball's golden age. All right, let me know if you have any questions about this lesson. I want to thank you for taking this lesson on baseball, America's pastime. Hope you found it informative and interesting. And stay tuned for our next exciting lesson in Intro to Sports. Okay, you know how to finish. Right-click on the slide, select End Show from the menu, and you're out of here. Thank you again for taking this lesson.